This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand. I'm Joe Hildebrand. That probably didn't need to be said, but I'm saying it anyway because you're here, I'm here, and we've got an absolutely fantastic show lined up. Huge stories this week right across the globe and right here in Australia. What is going on in Europe? A massive upsurge in support for far-right parties at the European Union elections. What is going on? Is this Donald Trump taking over Europe? What's going on with Donald Trump? He's just given a speech in Las Vegas all about sharks. What is the Trump policy on sharks? I'll reveal that very shortly. And what is going on at Channel 9? Their chairman, Peter Costello, has been hip and shouldering reporters. I know we've all wanted to do that from time to time. I've had a few politicians wanting to do it to me. But you're not meant to follow through, are you? Well, he's fallen on his sword now, and we'll find out exactly how that unfolded and why very shortly. But first, the biggest story in Australian politics, and daylight second, is Peter Dutton's bombshell announcement that he is going to drop the Paris Agreement target for 2030. Now, why is this important and why does this matter? Let me explain. Australia and a whole bunch of other countries all get together in Paris and they sign this climate accord, which basically says that they're going to cut emissions by X amount by 2030. Now, the benchmark for cutting these emissions is the output of emissions in 2005. So basically, by 2030, Australia is supposed to have cut what it was emitting in 2005 by 43%. Is it going to actually be able to do this? No way. Absolutely not. But does this mean we should not still have a target to do it? Well, Labor says yes. Labor says they might even have a snowflake's chance in hell of actually getting there. But Peter Dutton has basically said, nah, if we're not going to reach the target, why bother even having a target? So why does any of this matter? If we all know that we're not going to meet the target in 2030, what difference does it make if the target's not there at all? And if both parties say that they're going to get to net zero by 2050, well, aren't we all still on the same page anyway? So this Paris Agreement is not worth the paper it's printed on. Well, the reason it matters has nothing to do with Paris, and it doesn't even have much to do with climate change. What it has to do with is the electoral politics in Australia since the last federal election in 2022. In short, it's all the fault of the Teals. So when the Teals took over all the inner city or leafy suburban Liberal seats, the well-heeled gentry, the sort of, well-to-do, la-di-da, cosmopolitan, international jet-set type Liberals, as opposed to the Liberals out in the suburbs or the Nats out in the regions and the bush. When the Teals took all those seats, they said that they were doing it to force the Liberal Party to the left on climate change. They said, we are going to campaign on climate change and punish the Liberals for not going hard enough on climate change, and then they'll listen to us and they'll adopt harder targets. They'll adopt higher targets on climate change. They'll be more proactive. That's a bit like kidnapping someone and demanding a ransom, but then shooting the hostage before you've got the money. Because the problem is that now the Liberals don't have any of those seats and don't need to appeal to any of those voters who care so much about the climate because, of course, the Teals are there already representing them. In fact, it means that the Liberal Party can shift to the right on climate change, can abandon harder targets because it doesn't need to worry about holding those seats. It knows it's not going to get them back. Instead, it has to concentrate on other things like cost of living, kitchen table issues. And Peter Dutton said exactly that to Chris O'Keefe on 2GB.
Paris Agreement, does it stay or does it go under your prime ministership?
It stays, and we've got a strong commitment to net zero by 2050, but we've got to be realistic about where families are at the moment, the amount of hurt and pain that people are feeling in their own budgets.
So far from forcing the Liberal Party to the left on climate change, the Teals have forced the Liberal Party to the right. They don't know they're doing that, of course, because they're too stupid and they've got their heads so far up their overprivileged asses that they don't actually know how politics works. But it is precisely what they've done. And not only have they done it, they've done it with such incredible precision. Because the biggest victim of the Teals, the one who was the cause for the Teals even existing, the one that upset Simon Holmes à Court and started this whole Climate 200 movement, was Josh Frydenberg. And Josh Frydenberg was the presumptive leader in waiting of the Liberal Party after they lost the 2022 election. Everyone knew he was going to be the leader of the Liberal Party. He had the numbers to be the leader of the Liberal Party and take over from Scott Morrison, of course, who all the Teals hated so very, 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 very much. And Josh Frydenberg is committed to action on climate change. Josh Frydenberg, if he had been the leader of the Liberal Party, would have been jumping towards the 2030 target. He'd already committed to it, jumping towards net zero by 2050 instead of saying, oh yeah, maybe we'll get there in the end. Blah, 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 blah. In fact, it was Josh Frydenberg who wrote Malcolm Turnbull's Climate Change and Energy Policy. Josh Frydenberg was the author of the policy that Malcolm Turnbull was going to implement when he was the Prime Minister. And it was that energy policy that caused the revolt in the Liberal Party and caused Peter Dutton to challenge Malcolm Turnbull for the leadership. And of course, as a result of all the machinations that followed, Scott Morrison came up through the middle, took a few votes from either side, and in a very Machiavellian and very canny political manoeuvre, managed to get the Prime Ministership for himself. Now, of course, Scott Morrison has lost the election in 2022, and Josh Frydenberg, who was aligned with Malcolm Turnbull and a progressive Liberal Party climate policy, has been shafted by the Teals in the name of a more progressive climate policy. So the guy that literally wrote the book for Malcolm Turnbull on climate doesn't get elevated to the leadership of the Liberal Party and therefore taking it to the left on climate change as the Teals say they want. No, he gets killed by the Teals. Victim number one, first back against the wall. And who replaces him? The guy who killed off Malcolm Turnbull because of his progressive climate policy. And now this guy is neck and neck with Labor in the polls. The Coalition and Labor are 50-50 according to the latest news poll. Peter Dutton is making ground on my beloved Anthony Albanese. And it's all because the Teals knocked off Josh Frydenberg for the leadership. Now, maybe Josh would be doing an equally bang-up job politically. Who knows? But he certainly wouldn't have lurched to the right on climate as Peter Dutton had done. And I doubt very much he'd be going around championing nuclear power as Peter Dutton is doing. And the only reason that is not happening is because Josh Frydenberg is not there. And of course, that is all thanks to Simon Holmes à Court and the Teals knocking him off. So well done. Another spectacular own goal by our friends in the Teals. But it's not just the Teals, of course. The Greens have also hollowed out Labor in its own inner city seats and knocked off Labor MPs overwhelmingly from the left in those seats, thinking that that is going to push Labor to the left on climate change. If we kill all their MPs, then surely they'll listen to us. Well, no, because of course now Anthony Albanese has to deal with Peter Dutton jumping to the right on climate change and opening up this new battlefront in the climate wars that up until the generation of the Teals that took over, we thought were all over. We thought that once Morrison accepted net zero by 2050, after an editorial series at News Corp that I myself helped to lead. Completely unrelated, of course, but that's the timeline of events. We thought the climate wars were over, but now they've started again. And why have they started? How have they started? They've started because Peter Dutton no longer has to pay lip service to climate change targets or climate change action, or at least the conventional targets and the conventional action, in order to save those seats. So again, the Teals thought that they could hold these seats hostage and then demand Peter Dutton act in order to get them back. That's not really how politics works. That's not really how democracy works. No, they've shot the hostage and then asked for the ransom. So this massive snafu has now sparked speculation, yet again, you could set your watch to it, that Anthony Albanese is going to call an early election. And now they're saying he's going to call an early election on climate change. He's going to make it a poll about climate change. You could set up something in the Senate so there's a double dissolution trigger and go to the polls early, or indeed just use this existing bandwidth of time and go to an election. And why are you going to an election early, Albo? They'll say, so for climate change, for Mother Earth, for the planet. I'm going to fight this election based on the 2030 target that we're probably not going to meet anyway. Now, you can probably judge from that just how good an idea I think this is. And indeed, I'm pretty sure that Albo thinks it's a pretty terrible idea as well. And I'm pretty sure that Albo will still go the distance and hold an election sometime in the first half of next year, possibly not even till May, which gives the most likely chance of an interest rate cut before the government goes to the polls, which will mean that people think that everything's getting better, which will make them feel good about the future, which will make them think that the government's doing an okay job and they want the same people around in that future, and hopefully give the government the chance to say, look, see, we told you we would ease cost of living and now the RBA's cut interest rates. Thank you very much. Forget about the previous 1,500 rate rises. Look, they're coming down now. You're welcome. Thank you, ball boys. Thank you, linesmen. So that, I think, is still the plan. But there is talk that Albanese will call an early election on climate change. This would be, and let me spell it out to you in case you haven't detected any of the previous sarcasm, a terrible, 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 terrible idea. The last thing you want to do when people are struggling economically, physically, literally, in the real world, is force them to the polls on something that for most of them is abstract, that lies well into the future, that isn't directly affecting them right now, or if it is, they don't feel like it is, or they don't feel like it's important as other issues. And this comes up time and time again. People say they want action on climate change, but it's not a first order issue. The most important thing is putting food on the table, housing affordability, rental affordability, getting a roof over your head. We know that people are going hungry so that their kids can eat. We know that people are not being able to find houses at a record level, highest in a generation. The rental market is tighter than it has ever been, which is a sort of polite economic way of saying that people are homeless. They are couch surfing, living in cars on the street. I work with these organisations every day that have to look after these people. They are seeing people coming in who have never asked for help before. The Salvos, Vinnies, seeing otherwise normal middle-class families saying, we can't make ends meet anymore. Can you help us? It's heartbreaking. It's terrifying. You should help them if you can. Point being, you got a situation like this and you say, you know what the number one issue we're going to the polls on is? Whether or not we continue to be a signatory to a target that we're not going to meet, but it's important that we're still a signatory just so we can say that we have a target, even though we're not going to meet it. That is a very bad thing to go to an election on and force people to vote on at a time when they are literally dropping bricks about what's going to happen with next month's mortgage payment, how they're going to make ends meet, how they're going to pay the rent. And we know that that's what happens because that's how Brexit happened. We know that that's what happened because that's how Donald Trump happened. And again, we have seen just in Europe recently this huge swell of far-right parties who are sweeping aside conventional parties in the European Union Parliament. And that is going to happen as long as people are not listening to the concerns of people on the ground and instead talking about lofty ideological things. Now, we don't have to go overseas to see examples. Look at The Voice. When people were struggling under cost of living and the Voice vote went to the polls, it went from 60-40 in favour of an Indigenous voice to Parliament to 60-40 against. That is how politicians get punished if they are trying to impose their vision on people instead of listening to people in a time of crisis. When everything's good, when everything's great, then people do think about these big picture things. They think about, stuff in the future because they think it's a future that at least I'm going to get to. But when people are up against it in the here and now, the last thing they want is anything remotely ideological, anything remotely abstract. And that was what happened in the Voice campaign, unfortunately, as the campaign wore on and on and on. And I was a huge Yes supporter, as most people will know. People were doing it tougher and tougher and tougher, and suddenly they hear politicians talking about all this abstract stuff or trying to make them feel guilty for something that happened years and years and years ago. They're thinking, you know what? Screw you. And of course, a lot of you out there will say, well, the Voice campaign only went down. The Voice referendum was only lost because Peter Dutton didn't support it and ran a really negative campaign. Well, what do you think he's going to do at the next election? You think he's just going to say, no, that's it. No, I just wanted to dump the target. Yeah, go and vote for Albo. No, he's going to do the exact same thing. He's incredibly effective at it. So whatever you do, Albo, if you're listening, do not call an election on climate change.
It is the European Conservatives and Reformists, which are up from 69, and Identity and Democracy, up from 49 to 58. Those are the two groupings that include the populists and the hard right.
I mentioned before about this massive swing to far-right parties in the European Union elections. The EU has a parliament and they held elections just recently. Attendance was up. Usually people can't be asked voting for the EU. They go, oh, do I have to? I think a few years ago, only about 40% of people bothered voting. It's now well over 50, so a majority of people are actually voting. And they are swinging hard to the right, to populist parties, far right, hard right, whatever you want to call them parties. And I don't want to be too pejorative because people are voting for these parties for really good reasons. They're not saying, I'm going to vote for this party because I'm a racist and I hate immigrants and I hate black people and that's why I'm voting for AfD. That's the German party. Actually, if you're voting for them, you probably are a little tiny bit racist. But people have valid concerns. They have valid concerns. They're worried about immigration. They're worried about open borders, about nation states not having control of their borders. And again, a lot of the time, this isn't actually about immigration per se. It's just about his feeling of helplessness, of lack of control. So see images of people coming in over the border, and there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do. Even if you're not feeling that in your own community, even those sorts of images, that sense of helplessness makes people anxious. And of course, when people get anxious, they often get angry. And that's where you get these sort of lurches to sort of xenophobic parties or parties that try to prey on that. And again, the parties know what they're doing. They know that they can preach these really populist, simple solutions and that people who are afraid or worried will gravitate towards them. That's what populist, simple solutions are all about. And that's what populist parties are there to do. But that doesn't mean the people who are supporting them are in any way bad people. It just means that they're afraid and they're scared. And it means that they are not being represented. They do not feel like they are being represented by the parties in charge. And of course, the European Union as a great sort of project, as a great sort of experiment, has already and always been met with huge amounts of skepticism, especially by the working class, regular people, normal people. When the Brexit vote happened, it was working class people in the north of England who were probably the biggest factor in getting it over the line. And it was these kind of people that people in London simply didn't have a read on. They didn't realise that people were hurting, that they were anxious, they were worried about their jobs, they were losing their jobs in some cases. There was a huge influx of Polish immigrants to the UK at the time. And again, a big influx of immigrants, if you're an upper middle class person, if you're working in communications, you're working in the professions, that's not usually a threat to you. Usually, if you're doing anything involving communications or language, which most white-collar jobs do involve, then the language barrier alone is going to mean you're in pole position. And of course, these people coming in, they're not going for the very top jobs. They're not all coming in to become CEOs. Often they're coming in because they're filling labour shortages down the chain. They're coming in to do unskilled work or skilled labour. And so it's the people at the bottom of the tree, the bottom of the hill, who have most to lose and who are most worried about this. And so again, you have working class people, regular people who are feeling the brunt of this. Often it's them that are in a sort of competition with new migrants for housing. And it's people who are setting the policies and saying, oh, no, we need this for economic growth or whatever it may be, which often they do, or we need to let them in on humanitarian grounds, which often they should, who are making all these decisions but not realising what it feels like to be directly impacted by them. That's why they completely missed this with Brexit. They were completely blindsided by the fact that all these Labour voters in the north of England were saying, no. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn did a sort of very two-faced campaign. But let's not get into my Jeremy Corbyn rant just yet. So point being, if there is a disconnect between the leadership of any country, let alone the leadership of a sort of conglomerate, a global conglomerate like the EU, and the people who are living there, then those people sooner or later are going to come out with pitchforks and torches. And that is a completely expected, justifiable and reasonable thing for them to do. And it is the fault of the elites, if you will, the people who are holding the power, if they don't realise that that discontent has been building to that boiling point. And we saw that boiling point in the EU elections. France, which is France and Germany, the biggest two players in the EU, this has caused massive ructions in France and caused the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who many consider to be the sort of ultimate embodiment of, the progressive elite, if you like. He's a centrist. He himself rode to power on this sort of new, weird, centrist populist wave, a bit like Justin Trudeau in Canada. So they're both kind of, they're French centrists on either side of the Atlantic. And Macron rose to power with his En Marche party, and now suddenly he's going to the polls again, or rather he's sending his parliamentarians to the polls again, and his party, now called the Renaissance, bit pretentious, bit posh, and this is the president, right? His party is polling about 15%. 15% based on the numbers for the EU elections. So imagine that. Your president, you've only got 15% of the vote. That would be in Australia like Adam Bant being the Prime Minister. Or Pauline Hanson, take your pick. Marine Le Pen's party, on the other hand, the far-right party, this National Front party, they are polling more than double that at 30%. So that is the sort of primary vote that the Labor Party or the coalition would normally be looked at in Australia. So if that is the far right, the extreme right in France, where liberté, égalité, fraternité, the home of the glorious revolution, if that is far right, then suddenly the far right's pretty mainstream. The far right is actually probably your biggest party. And Macron has obviously thought, holy crap, it's not going to get any better. I better hit the trigger now. Another theory, and I really like this one, it's a bit three-dimensional chess, is that he knows that there's going to be another election in another couple of years' time. He himself cannot serve another term as president. He's in his second. But the idea would be you actually give the far right a chance of winning government. You let Le Pen win, or her proxy, young bloke, very photogenic apparently, and you say, all right, you think government's so easy, you have a go. And then you watch them make a complete and utter mess of it. And you say, see, I told you their answers are simplistic, they're stupid, they don't work. Now can we get back to politics as normal? The problem is that tends not to work. And also the problem is once people get power, they often don't like giving it back. Like the Teals, for example. That's why Josh Frydenberg's not the leader of the Liberal Party, just FYI. And let's have a look at America. Because in America, what did they do? Well, they didn't want to give Donald Trump the presidency, but he got it anyway. And he got it because he was talking to ordinary working people who were afraid of immigration, who were afraid of their jobs being sent offshore. And he talked to them in language they understood. Now, the solutions that he offered them were pretty simplistic. Some of them were just fanciful. Others were unachievable. I mean, he said he was going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. Kind of build a wall, bit of a fence here and there. Okay, we'll give him that. Mexico ain't paying for it. They haven't paid a cent. So they're not paying for it. But point being, people liked the sound of that. They voted for that. They got it. They were at least voting for someone who spoke their language. When Trump was addressing rallies in Pennsylvania, with thousands of cheering working class people, Hillary Clinton was hanging out with Beyonce. And the Democrats are the ones who are meant to be the party of the worker. When Trump was saying he was going to make America great again, he was telling people what he was going to do for the country. Like the great JFK said, ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. He was flipping that. He was saying, no, I'm telling you what I'm going to do for you. And what was Hillary Clinton's slogan? I'm with her. Hillary Clinton's slogan was, you have to pledge allegiance to me. Trump, for all his faults, was pledging allegiance to America and saying he was going to make it great again. So no surprises for guessing who won that election in 2016. Then, of course, this huge coalition stretching from Bernie Sanders socialists to Mitt Romney Republicans and everything in between, huge coalition of interests, all comes out in 2020 and votes Donald Trump out, and almost as a side effect of that, votes Joe Biden in. And everyone says, this is it. Joe Biden's got the biggest ever result in all of American history, the highest number of votes at any US federal presidential election ever in all of history of the oldest and greatest modern democracy. Joe Biden, unprecedented number of votes. You know who got the second highest in all of history? Donald Trump. And they were all just for him. Everyone else was voting against Donald Trump. And then if that had to be for Joe Biden by default, that's okay too. Donald Trump got all his votes just for being Donald Trump. Anyways, people didn't seem to think about that too much. I was trying to say, hang on, he's still got a lot of votes. Everyone said, oh, the nightmare's over, the nightmare's over. And now 4 years later, he's back. So that's what you get for playing three-dimensional chess with ancient democracies. And that is what France, America's oldest ally, which also became a democracy in 1789. Well, it became a kind of terror state for a while, but it was on the way to democracy. But anyway, I digress. Point being, France is now saying, apparently, if this is Macron's strategy, and it's hard to see any other one, well, maybe if we give this far-right group, power for 2 or 3 years and they make a complete hash of it, we'll just get this out of our system. Well, these guys have a habit of coming back. Meanwhile, America, a lot of people have said, just needs to get Trump out of its system. And that's exactly what they're going to do. So you've got Trump on the road to power in the US, and you've got Le Pen on the road to power in France. Again, how did this happen? How is it that all the smartest people in the room failed to see the people power that was propelling these people to the highest offices in their respective lands? Well, long before the EU result that shocked the continent, I came across a little story that I thought might offer a clue. In fact, I'd already copied and pasted it and said, you'll have to get the bleep machine ready. This is why they're fucked. It was an article that appeared in the New York Times on June 9. And the headline, when it was reprinted in the Sydney Morning Herald, was Culinary Diplomacy. Inside the opulent state dinner Macron held for Biden. And I felt myself thinking, is this really the kind of image that two men supposedly on the progressive side of politics, supposedly for the poor, the working class, the disenfranchised, really want to be projecting to the globe? This is how the article begins. Beneath the crystal chandeliers of the gilded reception hall of the Élysée Palace, opened in 1889 with a party for 8,000 people, French President Emmanuel Macron hosted US President Joe Biden at a state dinner intended to celebrate a very old alliance and demonstrate that the bond is greater than its intermittent frictions. Biden, addressing the French leader as Emmanuel, isn't that his name, rose from a long table adored with a bouquet of pink peonies and roses to say that, quote, France was our first ally, and that is not insignificant. He cited a book titled The Pocket Guide to France that he said was distributed to the American forces who 8 decades ago fought their way up the Normandy bluffs through a hail of Nazi gunfire to wrest Europe from tyranny. And on and on and on it goes. We stand together when the going gets tough, Biden says. And it's here that the author of the article seems to become slightly self-aware, seems to realise what is actually happening here. Because he goes on, he says, "The going was scarcely that. At a sumptuous dinner served at tables set between the fluted columns of a room conceived a century after the French Revolution to project the glory of the Republic. Beneath golden caryatids and a painted ceiling medallion reading 'The Republic Safeguarding Peace,' battalions of liveried waiters in white bow ties bearing silver trays served with impeccable precision a 4-course meal accompanied by champagne and a 2006 Chateau Margaux that had taken 18 years to achieve perfection." Now, if I was a working class person in France reading that, I'm pretty sure there aren't too many working class people who subscribe to the Times. But if I was, that would make me want to start another revolution. That would make me want to storm that building and burn it down. And yet here you have these two progressive leaders of the free world who are engaging in this. And this, remember, is just days out before that EU election that shocked the entire continent and much of the world. Where did all these people come from? They wondered. They came, I suspect, from seeing scenes like that, reading about things like that, and feeling that their leaders were completely out of touch with their concerns. And again, just days after, I copied and pasted that and said, holy crap, this is the worst possible thing, worst possible image that Macron or Biden could possibly ever want presented of them. Just days after that, both men are now fighting for their very survival. Speaking of images you don't want projected for all the world to see, here's Channel 9 chairman Peter Costello pushing a reporter who dared to ask him questions at Canberra Airport about the future of the company amid revelations of the poor behaviour of a former senior news executive.
Were you aware of those allegations, Mr. Costello? Why won't you support Mr. Sneesby publicly?
Good to see you.
Well, you've got to answer the questions, Mr. Costello. Don't. You've just assaulted me. You've just pushed me. It's all on camera. That was quite violent behaviour, Mr. Costello. Journalists who work for Nine approach people in this manner every day, and you attacked me just then.
Now, of course, that incident has been poured over and clawed over by every single media organisation ad nauseum, including the media organisation that Peter Costello was once the chair of. Here's him explaining what happened afterwards at Parliament House.
As I walked past him, he walked back into an advertising placard and he fell over. I did not strike him. If he's upset about that, I'm sorry, but I did not strike him.
Now, there's plenty that's wrong with that statement, but let's just quickly deal with the basics. Firstly, if the reporter just tripped and fell over by accident, why did Peter Costello stop and laugh and then try to create his own version of events that happened, like articulate it and say what just happened? Secondly, why was Peter Costello saying, I did not strike the reporter? No one accused him of striking the reporter. Clearly what the footage shows is him approaching and then continue to approach until he's making contact with the reporter, seemingly with his shoulder, and then pushing him so that he falls onto the ground. And if indeed Peter Costello's version of events is completely correct and the reporter just fell over all by himself, despite what witnesses said and despite what the footage shows, why did Peter Costello suddenly quit as chairman of Channel 9 on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of a long weekend? That is not what happens when you've done nothing wrong. But now to someone who really can do no wrong. Donald Trump gave this speech at a rally in Las Vegas, Nevada recently. It was posted on Twitter and it is perhaps the finest oratory of any politician I have ever seen or heard. This is Donald Trump imagining what would happen if he was on an electric-powered boat and a shark came along.
So I said, let me ask you a question. And he said, nobody ever asked this question. And it must be because of MIT, my relationship to MIT. Very smart. He goes, I say, what would happen if the boat sank from its weight and you're in the boat and you have this tremendously powerful battery and the battery's now underwater and there's a shark that's approximately 10 yards over there. By the way, a lot of shark attacks lately. Do you notice that? A lot of shark. I watched some guys justifying it today. Well, they weren't really that angry. They bit off the young lady's leg because of the fact that they were not hungry, but they misunderstood who she was. These people are crazy. He said there's no problem with sharks. They just didn't really understand a young woman swimming now really got decimated, and other people too. A lot of shark attacks. So I said, so there's a shark 10 yards away from the boat, 10 yards, or here. Do I get electrocuted? If the boat is sinking, water goes over the battery, the boat is sinking. Do I stay on top of the boat and get electrocuted? Or do I jump over by the shark and not get electrocuted? Because I will tell you, he didn't know the answer. He said, nobody's ever asked me that question. I said, I think it's a good question. I think there's a lot of electric current coming through that water. But you know what I'd do if there was a shark or you get electrocuted? I'll take electrocution every single time. I'm not getting near the shark.
So to summarise, Donald Trump imagined himself on an electric boat that was sinking and him being trapped underwater with a battery that was about to electrocute him, and his only means of escape was to swim into the water where a shark was approaching. Faced with this dilemma, he decided that he would prefer to stay and be electrocuted. And that is why he is going to be president, people, because absolutely every single person would make that exact same decision. The man's a genius. And that's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for listening to The Real Story. If you love what we do, make sure you leave us a rating and a review. If you want us to cover anything, get in touch via therealstory@novapodcasts.com.au, or you can always drop me a line on Instagram. My handle is @Joe_Hildebrand, and I'll chat to you next week. Take care.